Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to talk you through step by step how I came to build this L-shaped banquette seating. This project has been so much fun and the design of it is simple enough, I think, for anyone of any skill level to take on. And I'm going to share every step with you from the initial design and inspiration right through to the finishing touches. So let's get started. So how did I come up with this design? Well, I started off planning for this by scouring the internet, mostly Pinterest actually, for inspiration. It's not a platform I use very often, but it's very good for things like this, and I ended up creating a board with the best images and designs I'd found. I decided a complete structure built from 3 or 4 by 2 was far too over-engineered and clunky, but I really liked this one as it used a lot less wood without compromising on strength. I sketched the design using my straight line pad. There's a link in the description. One day I'll learn SketchUp. Now, whilst most designs you see have a sloping back, they tend to have a horizontal seat, but very few have sloping seats, and I like the idea of sloping both for maximum ergonomics and comfort, but this was going to give me a major headache. More on that in a minute. Now, for my big old fitted wardrobe build, I used exclusively moisture resistant MDF, and the reasons on that project, I think it's easier to paint, and I was worried about warping. I think it's more stable. But for this job, I was really keen to keep costs down, and to be honest with you, I don't need it to be moisture resistant. And at almost half the price of moisture resistant, this MDF was definitely worth cost saving. So what was a big plan? Well, mostly made up as I went along, but 18mm for the triangular sections so I could screw stuff into it. 25 by 50mm treated battens, that's unplaned to keep it cheap and to anchor everything together. 18mm for the seat panel for strength, 12mm for the base and back, and I was going to do the panelling in 12mm but changed to 9 to better match the kitchen units. I reckon you can do base, back and panelling in 9mm to save cost and keep the weight down. Although weirdly 9mm is slightly more expensive than 12mm at my timber merchants. This was trickier than you'd think, but why when I had some great reference points on Pinterest? Well, both of these differed in terms of the angle of the seat and the height, which you kind of want to tally with the height of your chairs around the rest of the table, whilst factoring in the thickness of any cushions you might decide to put on your banquette. So after weighing up the options, I came up with a compromise between these two designs, and with the base sloping already, I decided this cutout for your feet wouldn't be necessary. I cut out a template and marked it out on half a sheet of MDF I had lying around from a previous build. And then to make the cuts, I used the Erbauer track saw I bought for the wardrobe build. Now, if you're mulling over buying a track saw, which I'd say is pretty essential for a job like this, but you don't want to pay silly money, remember a comment that Super Sweet Gamers made on my channel yesterday. The best tools are the ones you can afford. That is so true. Some carpenters will be a bit snobby about tools like this, but 170 quid, you get a lot of tool for your money. It comes with a 1.2 meter track, and I added a 2.8 meter track, which you'll see in action shortly for another £88. And if you go for a long one like this, you don't have the hassle of trying to bolt it together straight. But the point is, although it's not the most accurate, you have to factor in a 2mm gap between the edge of the rail and where the saw plunges. Although actually looking at this close up, it can clearly do with a new splinter guard, and I've had one in the drawer for the last couple of years. It's done the job brilliantly on my wardrobes and this build. For occasional use, you can't beat a tool like this. With a batch of the triangular seat sections cut, I then had to remove each from the sheet of MDF, and I did this by drilling holes that I could then slot my jigsaw into to separate each from the sheet. I did take one track cut too far and glued it together with Puricol, which is an expanding polyurethane glue. You'll notice there are 4 cutouts in each piece for those horizontal supports, and also a cutout in the corner for the skirting board, just so I'd show you I haven't forgotten how to use a saw. I was making progress, but as I found out from the comedic moment each piece of the spine fell over like a load of dominoes, they needed some means of support, and that's where the 25 by 50mm green treated timber battens came in. 28 metres bought for a princely sum of £20 including VAT. So I bought these screws from the Phillips family, designed for MDF. They weren't very good. Even with a pilot hole, they split the timber. What I wanted was these from Spats, which I'd used on the wardrobe. The Phillips screws were so bad, I went out and bought myself a set of these. And that is the difference. Not a single crack on the joint. There's another one. Because you don't even need a pilot hole. What else is there to say? Glue. You'll see a never-ending supply of this. This isn't a magic pot. I just kept filling it up from this. But this has a brilliant applicator. This is why I'm holding on to this old pot of Gorilla. The applicator on this is rubbish. Didn't have to cut out those notches for the 25 by 50 sections too carefully. Just as long as they weren't sticking out past the edge, they did the job. Which is one of the reasons I love the simplicity of this design. If you can, get yourself a miter saw because it makes jobs like this so easy. But failing that, you can achieve lovely straight cuts with a circular saw and rafter square as a guide. And 45-degree cuts as well. Now, I didn't want to build the banquette in one solid L-shaped piece in case I wanted to move it for whatever reason. So I decided to create a 45-degree angle where the two pieces butted up to each other. And to support these angles, I cut two slightly elongated pieces of that MDF. Screwed, as with the others, into those 2x1 or 25 by 50mm battens. And I glued and screwed this extra little bit of batten underneath just for a bit of added strength. This left me with this slightly awkward corner shape, which I decided to cut off at 45 degrees with my track saw, as it would make finishing those base plates into the corner much easier. The corner now streamlined, it would be much simpler to screw that front piece to. Things were progressing well and it was time to add flesh to the bones of this seating. But then I hit a problem, and maybe this is why you don't see any L-shaped banquettes with sloping seats for comfort. I couldn't visualise how that corner was going to look until I'd built it out. But on completing it, I realised that the sloping bases created an awkward V where they butted up to each other, which would be a little uncomfortable to sit on. I mulled this over for a couple of days and then realised I'd probably made that slope a little bit too extreme. And that if I added a batten, I had a couple left over luckily, on top of the existing batten at the back, that would solve the problem and also add a bit of strength at the one point in the banquette where it probably needed it, while still leaving the seating area with a decent slope. It did mean I had to add new slivers of MDF to every single triangular piece, but this was really easy to make on the track saw and sand and plane down to exactly the right depth using my vintage block plane and my electric planer. With the angle reduced, we can move on to the next stage. And so we're onto the seat panels. Now we're in my messy garage because I want to show you can do nice jobs like this in slightly chaotic circumstances. Here's my old workbench, crucial for ripping down full sheets of MDF. And actually, because of storage issues, I've put a lot of the sheets I'm cutting on the workbench itself. And the reason I can do that is because I'm using the offcuts from the structural part, the triangular sections of the banquette, to actually put underneath the sheet I'm cutting as a sort of sacrificial surface. Pretty straightforward cutting. I just needed to put a piece of 18mm on the banquette and trace off the edges. The front edge, however, did need I think it was 13-degree cut to line up with the sloping base panel, but this was a breeze as you can simply set the track saw to the correct angle. And for the record, I absolutely didn't crawl across the top of the workbench whilst doing one rip cut, because that would obviously be completely irresponsible. I temporarily screwed a couple of batten offcuts to the front so I could be sure the seat panel was lined up with the base front edge when I fixed it in place. And then I applied the wood glue, clamped it in one corner to stop it moving, and then nailed it down. I hope your heart doesn't sink when you see me using this airless 18-volt finish nailer. Bought this from Ryobi about 6 years ago and it's absolutely fantastic. You can of course use panel pins and your hammer as usual. And I'm using these 50mm 16 gauge nails for the main panels and then these 20mm 16 gauge nails for this panelling. More on that in a minute. And so we're onto the back and base panels, which as the visual suggests had to be angled at the top and bottom so they were horizontal at these points in spite of the angle of each. But this was again an easy procedure to do on the track saw once I'd set the angle on my sliding bevel and checked it using the protractor. And don't worry if you get the angle slightly wrong as I did here, as you can plane it once it's fixed in place, as I did. You must get yourself a block plane as they're such fantastic tools, and the vintage ones on eBay have much better quality steel than the brand new ones. Thanks to my carpenter mate John for that top tip. And speaking of mistakes, you'll have seen this join here. Admittedly, this is probably one of the easier mistakes to make because I've angled the top and the bottom. I've cut the angle on the wrong end, it should be over there. Ah! Now that join is mostly hidden by the front panelling, but on the longer banquette I had to join sections given they were longer than a full sheet of MDF. So here I screwed a batten offcut to one of the vertical sections to increase the surface area before gluing and nailing the extension piece in place, and it's totally invisible on the finished seat. Probably not necessary to glue that batten in, because on the base panel I just joined 2 front panels on top of the 18mm structural section behind, and it's been fine. And the final point to make is you've got some 45-degree angles to cut where the base panels butt up in the corner. Now at this point I started to worry about the height I'd set for those triangular structural elements. In short, I didn't think the back was quite high enough. Don't forget all dimensions will be in the plans, but I also hadn't worked out how I was going to finish that top edge, so I came up with a plan. I cut down some treated 3x2 I had lying around using my circular saw. This gave me the finished height for the back panel, which I could then cut again at an angle. Holes could then be piloted and that top section glued and screwed onto the banquette. And for those back panels I dampened the surface before applying some more of that Puricol glue in case I had any gaps that the glue needed to expand into. As you can see here. So the structure was complete, but it was still a bit of a rough work in progress. It was time to finesse it with the outer panelling to bring it into line with the styling of the rest of the kitchen. To do this I cut the 9mm sheet of MDF into 80mm strips and glued and nailed them into the banquette. And again they had to be angled at these 3 points and where the panelling met the corners. Again I had to cut 45-degree angles to one edge. Clearly this whole process has been trial and error, and my advice to you would be to butt up the base panel to the underside of the seat panel rather than how I've done it here. That way you only have one sheet of end grain exposed on the seat panel surface. And another tip, put glue on the end grains of the panels as well, as this will bind the 2 pieces together and minimise the chances of them separating when being painted, although you always have the chance of filling, as you'll see shortly. I did a video on skirting scribing recently and someone said I should have used a jigsaw rather than my coping saw. Well, here you go, but I still prefer my coping saw, and actually this scribe didn't turn out too shoddy. I had this end piece to mark and cut, and remember this side panel and the rail that goes on the top are the best opportunities you've got to hide any gaps between the banquette and the wall behind. I also had this corner section to sand, where I'd cut the panel at the wrong end and had to join it. All nicely covered up, and finally the vertical pieces to complete the look. I'd done a bit of freestyle planing on the top, and then I glued a piece of 12mm MDF I had left over and sealed those cut edges with some 18x4mm pine D-shaped moulding that I'd bought from my local timber merchants, if I'm honest, without really knowing at the time where I was going to use it. And now we're on to that section that I think we all dread, filling and sanding in preparation for painting so that we can guarantee an end product like this, possibly one of the dullest jobs in DIY. I had some raised edges that I routed flat like this, using this bit on my trim router, and then it was just a relentlessly long job of mixing up 2-part wood filler and tooling it into all the pin nail holes, which I'd recessed with a punch where the gun hadn't done the job properly, and also any other imperfections, gaps between panelling and areas where you could see the edges of those base panels. For a job like this, mix up small quantities because it will go off quickly. Tool in as little as possible, leaving it just proud of the surface. And most important of all, get yourself a random orbit sander because it takes literally all the effort out of sanding. And when connected like mine is to the Henry vacuum, it removes all that nasty dust that's normally generated. That top rail needed a bit of scribing to a slightly uneven wall, and again that lovely vintage block plane comes into its own. Even though it's a plane, when turned at a steep angle, you can chamfer off pretty much any contour to leave you with a perfectly scribed surface. Normally I dread painting as much as the prep work, but I was actually quite looking forward to it. I started with the Johnston's MDF primer, which I had lying around from a comparison video I did 7 years ago. Cyclone paint stirrers, you need one of these in your toolkit. I've got a Worcester paint scuttle with a liner in it, and I particularly like the magnetic patch that you can attach your paintbrush to keep it out of the paint. Big fan of this paint scuttle and also their red feather mini roller sleeve for a really smooth finish. For us, I was pretty impressed with this paint. Decent coverage, and when it came to the panels, I'd start with a small paintbrush in the corners and then follow on with the Worcester red feather to get as close into the corners as possible to mask those paint strokes. Then a little bit of a sand, particularly paying close attention to those end grains inside the panels, and a second primer coat. And I also had a small gap between the back and seat panels that needed a bit of a caulk. And then it was on to the AquaGuard, which is a fairly new paint in the Johnston's range, and apparently their most durable water-based paint, which I bought in a matte finish. I actually think the satin finish would have been a bit of a closer match to our cupboards. I was worried that 1 litre wasn't enough, but remarkably that tiny pot has done 3 coats, and there's a bit left for touch-ups. And a little bit of a tip, in between coats you can seal the scuttle by rollering paint along the top edge, which will provide an airtight seal for the cling film. Then leave it in a cold place and the next day it will be ready to go again. They do produce lids for these liners, but at least this way you can leave the roller in there. Why 3 coats? Well, 1 coat is definitely not enough. Coat 2 consolidates the first to a point that the finish is acceptable, and the 3rd coat just builds on that, and I always think each coat is as much as anything about making sure you're going over areas you've missed. Painting is not one of my favourite jobs, but I found this very satisfying. Coverage was good, it was dry within minutes, and that little 1 litre tin went such a long way. I was amazed I managed to get 3 coats out of it. Only time will tell if Johnston's claim about durability bears up, and whether I should have gone with something like, say, an Orchid paint, as was recently recommended to me. But maybe let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. So that's it. I'm almost a bit gutted to say I'm done. I didn't bother painting the internal structure behind, as quite frankly it didn't need it, and in the case of the AquaGuard I wouldn't have had enough paint. But this no frills rear is, I think, appropriate to what is a no frills design, made from low cost materials. The total cost of this project to date has come to £205, which I think is pretty good value. And don't forget there will be plans on my Buy Me a Coffee page, hopefully by the time this video goes live, which you can purchase for a small fee to help keep the lights on at Charlie DIYte. Have I had any issues? Yeah, I'm not massively chuffed with the way this corner goes together. I think I could have perhaps done that a little bit better, but it will of course be completely invisible when the cushions are on it and the table's pushed up. Also, there's the odd area on the seat top where I think I could have filled it a little bit better. That point I made earlier about having your seat base, the seat base coming right to the front so that you've only got the paneling up against it. That way you're minimalizing the end grains on show. Now I said project costs so far because I have ordered some base and back cushions in a foam core with a feather wrap, and the base cushions have actually arrived now. The reason I ordered them separately is so that I could measure the back once the cushions were in, so I got it absolutely right. I want the back cushion to come just underneath this lip of that top rail. And I think once the cushions have been made and the fabric's been bought and the covers have been made for the cushions, that will probably triple the cost of this build, but it is an important part because the comfort of this banquette is kind of what defines it. But I think the whole thing will probably come in at just under £1,000, which is getting a little bit more expensive, but again, I think is good value for what we've got here. And of course, if you go make one of these yourself, you don't really need cushions, but if you decide to do it, you can probably get them a lot cheaper online. And like I said on the outdoor furniture build, plan your banquette around cushions you can budget for. And don't forget, you're going to get so much satisfaction from building it. Also, did think I'd messed up here by not extending this front panelling slightly above the top so that it created a bit of a lip to keep the cushion in place. But then I thought, well, I can always fit a lip later on, which will probably be stronger than having this jutting over the front. And also what I have done is put some non-slip rug underlay underneath the cushion, which literally keeps the cushion completely anchored in position. So actually I think the lip probably isn't necessary. So that's it for today. I hope you've found this useful and it does inspire you to make your own. Details of everything I've used, and don't forget those plans, will of course be in the description below the video. And if you're new to my channel, it would mean the world to me to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here, and don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.